Welcome to Forbidden Archives. Tonight, we open a forgotten chapter where passion dictated policy and scandal redrew the map of history. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe and let us know one word that defines this story for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights and prepare to confront the outrageous secrets of the past. Shadows in the throne room. Royal courts have long been painted as bastions of pomp, ceremony, and unyielding hierarchy, where dynasties are forged, alliances cemented, and the fates of nations are inscribed in bloodlines. Yet, beneath the gilded surface of these courts, there existed a shadowed realm where loyalty, affection, and passion quietly intertwined with politics. In this hidden world, women of rank and power engaged in intimate relationships with one another, relationships that, though rarely recorded openly, reverberated across the corridors of influence, subtly shaping decisions, alliances, and legacies. Tonight, we peer into these shadows, uncovering the stories of secret female lovers whose bonds, whether romantic or intensely emotional, left traces in history that remain astonishingly potent today. These connections were never casual. They were not fleeting courtly flirtations or idle friendships. They were relationships forged in secrecy, often against the rigid expectations of dynastic duty, and in some cases, they altered the trajectory of empires. Across Europe's royal courts, from the frost-bound palaces of Sweden to the glittering halls of London and Paris, certain women forged alliances of the heart that transcended mere companionship. Some wielded these bonds to influence political decisions, secure appointments, or manipulate the succession. Others offered solace and counsel in a world where female rulers were constantly scrutinized, judged, and constrained by patriarchal norms. Yet, paradoxically, the very secrecy that protected these women also contributed to their erasure from historical memory. Public records, official correspondence, and state documents overwhelmingly focus on male-centered narratives: the king, the prince, the heir. Women were seen primarily as vessels for lineage, and the language of intimacy between women was rarely considered worthy of record. When these relationships did appear in letters or chronicles, their emotional depth was often masked by euphemism or dismissed as mere friendship. Scholars today sift through these ambiguities, interpreting subtle hints in correspondence, shared domestic arrangements, and courtly rituals to reconstruct relationships that were once invisible to the official eye. Consider, for instance, the nature of female intimacy at court. Unlike men, whose same-sex liaisons sometimes left behind clear legal or financial documentation, women were confined by social expectations to secrecy. Expressions of love or affection were encoded in gestures, letters written in private hand, or acts of companionship that outwardly appeared innocuous but held deep personal significance. Sharing a bed, exchanging personal garments, or attending exclusive salons together were acts that, while superficially innocent, could signify intense emotional or romantic bonds. For modern historians, decoding these signs is a delicate task, requiring careful attention to context, contemporary norms, and subtle language. The stakes were high. In a courtly environment where a single scandal could result in exile, imprisonment, or loss of influence, the women who loved other women had to navigate a treacherous landscape. Their choices were not merely personal, they were political. To align with the wrong person, or to express attachment in the wrong manner, could jeopardize alliances, court favor, or even national stability. And yet, some women did take that risk, not only for personal fulfillment, but because these relationships offered power in ways marriage, duty, or conventional alliances could not. Take, for example, the northern courts of Europe in the 17th century. Here, a queen could wield immense authority, but her legitimacy was constantly scrutinized. The pressure to marry strategically and produce heirs was relentless, yet some queens resisted these pressures, finding companionship and counsel in women who shared their intellect, ambition, or desire for autonomy. These bonds could redefine power structures. The queen's confidante might advise on foreign policy, advocate for key appointments, or influence the monarch's perception of rivals. The intimacy between women at court was not merely a matter of the heart, it was entwined with the machinery of governance. This is the story of those hidden alliances, relationships that defied societal norms, and in doing so, subtly reshaped the course of history. We begin with one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures of early modern Europe, Christina, Queen of Sweden. Ascending to the throne in 1632, at the tender age of 6, after the death of her father, Christina would grow to become one of the most intellectually formidable and politically independent monarchs of her era. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Christina rejected marriage and the conventional role of a queen consort. Instead, she surrounded herself with women whose intelligence, wit, and emotional support she valued above dynastic compliance. Among them, Ebba Spar, a noblewoman renowned for her beauty, charm, and subtle influence, emerged as Christina's most trusted confidante. The bond between Christina and Ebba, as evidenced in surviving letters, poems, and court accounts, suggests a connection that transcended mere friendship. Their relationship was a carefully negotiated space of intimacy, a private world shielded from the broader court, yet potent in its influence. Historians debate the precise nature of their liaison, given the limitations of surviving documentation and the coded language of the period. Yet what is indisputable is that Ebba occupied a position of remarkable trust and authority at Christina's court, shaping both her personal life and political decisions. Their closeness challenged norms and highlighted how female companionship could operate as a conduit of influence in male-dominated political spheres. The existence of such relationships was rarely meant to be public knowledge. Gossip, however, inevitably spread, and historians today rely on both the whispers of contemporaries and the traces left in letters and poetry to reconstruct these hidden lives. These documents often reveal the intensity of emotion, the negotiation of power within intimacy, and the ways women navigated both love and survival. A seemingly trivial comment in a letter might signify deep emotional reliance. A shared journey or domestic arrangement could reveal strategic partnership. Every fragment is a puzzle piece, contributing to the reconstruction of a private yet politically resonant world. But the influence of these relationships was not confined to the domestic sphere. In some courts, the emotional alliances between women extended into diplomacy and governance. A queen's favored female companion might advise on appointments, negotiate with foreign envoys, or serve as an intermediary in sensitive political matters. In this sense, love and power were intertwined. Intimate bonds provided women with both emotional sustenance and a subtle, often invisible, channel of political agency. Understanding these dynamics challenges conventional narratives of history, demonstrating that influence and strategy were not solely the domain of kings, ministers, or male courtiers. Women, operating within their constrained social space, found ways to exert power through devotion, persuasion, and trust. As we journey through the forbidden archives, we encounter a pattern repeated across time and space. Whether in Sweden, Britain, or beyond, certain women cultivated private alliances that shaped decisions at the highest levels. Their stories are obscured by the passage of time, the biases of record keepers, and the silence imposed by social convention. Yet the evidence that survives, letters, diaries, poems, and the occasional chronicle, provides glimpses into a world where desire, loyalty, and ambition intersected in profound ways. Tonight, we peel back the veil on these hidden lives. We trace the connections that existed in secrecy, the networks of influence that were exercised behind closed doors, and the courage required to love in defiance of expectation. We explore how passion intersected with politics, how affection could become leverage, and how the clandestine relationships of women could, in subtle but tangible ways, alter the fate of nations. As we open the forbidden archives, the first secret begins to stir. The stories we will uncover challenge the very notion of historical invisibility, revealing that the threads of desire and loyalty often ran as deep as those of blood and title. Here, in the shadows of the throne room, we witness the intersection of love and power, and we begin to understand that what was hidden was never irrelevant. It was transformative. From Christina and Ebba to courts in Britain and France, this documentary will uncover the ways in which women shaped history not only through policy or marriage, but through devotion, secrecy, and courage. The women of the throne, it turns out, were never merely spectators. They were actors in the most dangerous, complex, and intimate political dramas of their age. The shadows of the throne room await, and as we delve into these stories, one question emerges: how many of history's pivotal moments were whispered in private chambers rather than decreed in public halls? When queens defied matrimony. In the grand tapestry of European history, the role of a queen was ostensibly simple: marry well, produce heirs, and secure the dynasty. Yet, in the labyrinthine corridors of power, some women chose a different path. These queens, far from passive instruments of dynastic ambition, navigated a complex world of expectation, scrutiny, and pressure, and in doing so, created opportunities for private bonds that would reverberate through courts, governments, and even across borders. Their refusal to conform to conventional marital expectations was not mere rebellion. It was a calculated negotiation of power, desire, and autonomy. To fully understand the significance of these choices, one must first appreciate the stakes. In a world where a queen's legitimacy was inseparable from her ability to produce heirs, declining marriage or resisting marital pressure was both radical and dangerous. Female sovereigns who defied matrimony risked political isolation, diplomatic tension, and the wrath of powerful relatives who viewed marriage as a tool of statecraft. Yet, for these women, personal agency and emotional fulfillment often outweighed compliance. In doing so, they opened space for alternative relationships, intimate, sometimes romantic, often fiercely loyal, that would serve as their counsel, comfort, and, crucially, their political leverage. Christina of Sweden, whom we introduced in Part 1, is perhaps the most vivid example. From a young age, Christina exhibited intellectual curiosity, political acumen, and a strong will. Her father, Gustavus Adolphus, and the Swedish Regency had envisioned a conventional marriage that would strengthen alliances. Christina, however, resisted every attempt at conventionality. She refused to marry, declining numerous suitors who promised powerful political connections. Instead, she surrounded herself with women whose intelligence and insight matched her own. Among these, Ebba Sparr became a central figure, an intimate companion whose influence extended beyond the personal and into the political. Their bond, whether romantic or profoundly emotional, demonstrated how queens could wield influence indirectly, through loyalty and trust, rather than through traditional dynastic power. Christina was not alone. In Britain, Queen Anne navigated a similarly complex landscape, though with slightly different constraints. Ascending the throne in 1702 after the death of William Roman III, Anne faced immense pressure to marry and produce an heir. Yet Anne's relationships with women such as Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, blurred the lines between friendship and influence. Sarah became both confidante and advisor, wielding considerable sway over Anne's decisions and appointments. While historians debate the precise emotional nature of their bond, it is clear that Anne's reliance on women of trust shaped her political environment, providing her with counsel that rivaled the influence of male courtiers and ministers. The deliberate cultivation of such relationships required subtlety. Queens could not openly flout expectations. Doing so risked scandal or destabilizing alliances. Instead, they engaged in coded forms of intimacy. Letters and personal correspondence reveal the language of affection and longing, carefully calibrated to remain within the bounds of social acceptability. Bedchamber arrangements, shared travel, and private salons became arenas where trust and influence could flourish unseen. In these spaces, queens exercised a form of power that was intimate, secret, and deeply consequential. The political dimension of these choices cannot be overstated. By relying on female confidantes, queens could circumvent traditional networks dominated by men, cultivating channels of counsel and negotiation that were both discreet and effective. These confidantes often acted as intermediaries in diplomatic discussions, advisors on appointments, and protectors of sensitive information. In effect, the Queen's private alliances became conduits of influence, allowing her to shape policy, patronage, and even international negotiations in ways that were invisible to the wider court. For example, Christina's court was rife with women who held unofficial sway. Beyond Ebba Sparr, Christina's relationships with intellectual women, artists, and diplomats created a network that extended her influence across Sweden and beyond. The Queen's refusal to marry allowed her to prioritize these relationships, transforming her personal choices into political instruments. Similarly, Anne's reliance on Sarah Churchill provided a parallel case where emotional intimacy and political maneuvering intersected. In both instances, the private realm of female friendship or love became a strategic asset, enabling queens to operate within, and sometimes above, the patriarchal constraints of their environment. Yet these bonds were precarious. The very secrecy that protected these relationships also made them fragile. Missteps, breaches of trust, or court gossip could undermine their stability. Anne's later falling out with Sarah Churchill illustrates the volatility inherent in such dynamics. Once a confidante was lost, the Queen's court and political life could shift dramatically, demonstrating that these relationships were not merely personal, they were integral to the exercise of power. Moreover, defiance of matrimony had social and cultural ramifications. Queens who remained unwed often faced criticism for their perceived eccentricity, indecision, or emotional volatility. Christina was mocked and gossiped about throughout Europe, and Anne was frequently the subject of scrutiny over her attachments to women. Yet these women endured, strategically leveraging their personal choices to maintain sovereignty and autonomy. Their courage in rejecting marriage was both personal and political, creating spaces in which private, same-sex alliances could flourish without overtly challenging the monarchy's stability. These queens also provide insight into the broader patterns of female power in historical courts. Across Europe, aristocratic and royal women often formed intense emotional attachments with other women, relationships that could function as support networks, informal advisory bodies, or even political tools. These bonds were rarely documented in the same detail as male alliances, but their significance is evident when considering the decisions, policies, and historical outcomes influenced by these women. Recognizing the impact of these relationships challenges traditional historical narratives, revealing a dimension of female agency that operated in secrecy but shaped events in tangible ways. At the heart of this dynamic was the interplay between personal desire and political necessity. Queens like Christina and Anne navigated an intricate landscape where their own emotional fulfillment was intertwined with their capacity to govern effectively. They understood that private relationships could be as powerful as official decrees, that loyalty and trust could be leveraged as instruments of policy. In doing so, they demonstrated that influence need not always be visible to the public eye. It could reside in the private sphere, flowing from heart to heart, bond to bond, affecting decisions that would resonate across nations. As we examine these stories, one recurring theme emerges: the defiance of expectation. By rejecting marriage or conventional courtly alliances, these queens created opportunities for influence that were alternative, clandestine, and transformative. They were architects of private power, curators of relationships that were both emotionally rich and politically significant. And it is in these hidden spaces, away from public scrutiny, behind closed doors, and within intimate correspondence, that some of history's most consequential alliances were forged. Tonight, as we continue to explore the forbidden archives, we will see how these choices, refusing to marry, cultivating female confidantes, and embracing private affection, laid the groundwork for relationships that altered the course of dynasties. We will meet the women who became indispensable to queens, the companions whose loyalty and intellect shaped decisions at the highest levels, and the intricate dance of power and passion that unfolded in secrecy. The stories of queens who defied matrimony remind us that history is rarely as straightforward as official records suggest. Behind proclamations, coronations, and treaties, there existed networks of trust, devotion, and desire, networks that operated in silence but had the power to influence entire nations. By understanding these relationships, we gain insight not only into the personal lives of extraordinary women, but also into the hidden mechanisms of political power. And so, as we leave the conventional narrative of dynasties and heirs behind, we step into a world where loyalty, passion, and strategy intersected in profound ways. Here, queens chose their companions with care, cultivated their bonds with intention, and used intimacy as a tool as potent as any royal decree. The defiance of matrimony was not merely a personal choice. It was a calculated strategy of influence, a pathway into hidden corridors of power that only the most astute and daring women could navigate. What follows in the Forbidden Archives is a journey through these relationships, their triumphs, their perils, and their profound impact on history. From secret chambers to the bedchambers of queens, from letters veiled in euphemism to alliances forged in whispered confidences, the stories of these women illuminate the power of love, trust, and devotion in shaping the fate of nations. Courtly intimacy, letters, bedchambers, and secrets. The royal court, for all its grandeur and ceremony, was a world of walls within walls. Behind the public display of crowns, scepters, and grand halls, there existed a private theatre where the most delicate and consequential dramas unfolded. For queens and noblewomen, this theatre was often inhabited by other women, companions, confidantes, and secret lovers, whose presence could shape decisions, influence policy, and alter dynastic outcomes. These relationships were rarely acknowledged in official records, yet they left traces in the most intimate spaces, letters, bedchambers, and private chambers where secrets were exchanged and power quietly exercised. Historians attempting to reconstruct these relationships face a fundamental challenge. The evidence is fragmentary and coded. Direct references to romantic or sexual attachment between women are almost non-existent, and much of what survives must be read between the lines. In letters, words like friend, beloved, or confidante carried layers of meaning understood only within the private context of the court. Shared sleeping arrangements, once a practical necessity in the overcrowded quarters of palaces, often also held emotional significance. Acts that may seem trivial to modern eyes, exchanging garments, attending private dances, or spending long hours together in secluded gardens, could signify profound intimacy and trust. Consider the correspondence between Christina, Queen of Sweden, and Ebba Spar. Surviving letters reveal not only affection and admiration, but also a profound emotional dependency. Christina frequently expressed longing and attachment in ways that transcend conventional notions of friendship. Ebba, for her part, responded with equal devotion, offering counsel, emotional support, and companionship during moments of political and personal crisis. For historians, the challenge is interpreting these letters without projecting modern assumptions onto them. What is clear, however, is that these communications were private, intentional, and emotionally charged, revealing a bond that extended far beyond mere courtly decorum. Letters were not the only medium through which these relationships were expressed. The bedchamber, long recognized by historians as a site of intimacy and influence, played a pivotal role. Royal women often shared rooms or beds for practical reasons, but these arrangements could also serve as spaces of trust, counsel, and emotional connection. In some instances, Queen's closest companions were the first to hear of confidential matters, providing advice that could sway political decisions. Such arrangements highlight the intersection of intimacy and power. A private bond could become a conduit for influence, subtly shaping the exercise of authority within the court. The secretive nature of these relationships also made them susceptible to rumor and gossip. Court observers, often male, frequently documented what they could perceive: close companionships, gestures of affection, or unusual attention between women, but lacked the language or understanding to describe these bonds fully. Historians must therefore navigate a delicate terrain, weighing contemporary accounts against letters, diaries, and other private documents to discern both the reality and the perception of intimacy. It is a process fraught with ambiguity, yet one that reveals remarkable insights into the power dynamics of royal courts. In Britain, the correspondence between Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill offers another lens. Their letters convey a deep emotional bond, one that combined personal affection with political negotiation. Sarah's influence over Anne was both intimate and strategic. She counseled on appointments, advised on foreign policy, and at times acted as the Queen's intermediary with other courtiers. The closeness of their relationship allowed Sarah a degree of access and authority rarely afforded to women, demonstrating how emotional intimacy could translate into political power. When their bond deteriorated, the consequences were immediate and profound, reshaping alliances, court favor, and policy decisions. Beyond letters and bedchambers, historians also examine other private spaces of the court, gardens, private galleries, and salons. These were arenas where trust and influence could be cultivated discreetly. Shared walks, private meals, and secluded conversations offered opportunities for confidantes to advise, persuade, and counsel their royal companions. In a patriarchal environment that often limited women's public authority, these private spaces became crucial sites of informal power. The Queen's choice of companion was therefore not only a matter of personal preference, but also a strategic decision with far-reaching consequences. Art and poetry also provide subtle, yet compelling, evidence of female intimacy. Portraits of queens alongside their favored companions sometimes depict gestures of closeness that go beyond conventional representation. Poems exchanged within the court often carried coded language of affection and devotion, understood fully only by the intended recipient. For historians, these cultural artifacts are invaluable, offering glimpses into relationships that were deliberately hidden from public view. They illuminate the emotional landscapes of royal women, revealing connections that shaped both their personal lives and the politics of the day. The practice of coded language extended into public ceremonies. Queens and their companions often used formal gestures, titles, and rituals to communicate allegiance, trust, and preference. The arrangement of seating at events, the assignment of honors, and the visibility of certain attendants all carried meaning, serving as both public acknowledgement and subtle signaling within the court. Understanding these nuances requires careful study of ceremonial practices, correspondence, and surviving memoirs. It is here, in the interplay between public formality and private intimacy, that the complexity of female influence in royal courts becomes apparent. Historians also grapple with the challenge of distinguishing genuine romantic attachment from intense friendship. In early modern Europe, emotional intimacy between women was often expressed in ways that modern readers might interpret as romantic or sexual, but which contemporaries may have viewed as conventional. The distinction is not always clear, yet the intensity, exclusivity, and influence of these relationships often transcended simple friendship. What matters most is the impact. These bonds provided emotional sustenance, counsel, and in some cases, the capacity to shape decisions at the highest levels of power. The secrecy of these relationships was not only protective but strategic. A queen's confidante could act as an intermediary in delicate negotiations, a repository for secrets, and a stabilizing force in times of crisis. The very act of cultivating a trusted female companion allowed a queen to exercise a form of influence that bypassed male-dominated structures. These alliances reveal a sophisticated understanding of human dynamics. Emotional bonds could be leveraged to maintain stability, exert control, and guide policy without attracting unwanted scrutiny. As we trace these patterns across courts, a broader picture emerges. From Sweden to Britain, and across the courts of France, Spain, and beyond, female intimacy played a significant, if often hidden, role in the governance of nations. The relationships between queens and their female companions demonstrate that influence was not solely derived from formal authority. It could be exercised through devotion, counsel, and trust. These private bonds were instruments of power, subtly guiding the decisions of those who appeared, publicly, to govern alone. In reconstructing these narratives, historians rely on fragments, letters, diaries, portraits, and contemporaneous accounts, to assemble a picture of intimacy and influence that challenges conventional historical narratives. Every whisper of affection, every coded phrase, every shared space becomes a clue, revealing the intersection of personal and political life in royal courts. The meticulous work of scholars allows us to appreciate the profound significance of these relationships, which, though hidden from view, shaped the course of history. As we conclude this exploration of courtly intimacy, one fact becomes clear. The relationships between queens and their female companions were far more than emotional attachments. They were strategic, consequential, and often transformative. Love, friendship, and devotion became tools through which women navigated the constraints of courtly life, influenced political outcomes, and exercised power in ways that were invisible to the casual observer. The shadows of letters, bedchambers, and secret chambers reveal a world in which passion and politics were inseparable. By examining these hidden spaces, we gain insight into the subtle, often overlooked mechanisms of influence that allowed women to assert authority, protect themselves, and shape the destinies of nations. The lives of these queens and their confidantes illuminate a complex interplay of desire, loyalty, and power that challenges our understanding of history itself. And so, as we leave behind the private corridors and hidden salons of early modern courts, the next chapter awaits. It is a chapter defined by one of the most famous, controversial, and illuminating cases of female intimacy in history, the passionate bond between Christina, Queen of Sweden, and Ebba Spar. Their relationship, filled with intrigue, loyalty, and undeniable influence, will bring into sharp focus the intersection of love and political power. Christina, Queen of Sweden, and Ebba Spar, a royal passion. Among the shadows of Europe's royal courts, few relationships stand out with as much intrigue, subtlety, and historical consequence as that between Christina, Queen of Sweden, and her confidante, Ebba Spar. Christina's reign, beginning in 1632 following the death of her father Gustavus Adolphus, was marked by brilliance, eccentricity, and defiance of convention. She was a monarch in every sense, intellectually formidable, politically astute, and unapologetically independent. Yet beneath the veneer of authority lay a profound need for companionship, trust, and intimacy. Needs she found fulfilled in Ebba, a noblewoman whose beauty, intelligence, and loyalty captivated the queen. From the earliest years of Christina's reign, her letters reveal a depth of feeling and reliance on Ebba that transcends mere friendship. Their correspondence, preserved in fragments in Swedish archives, is imbued with affection, longing, and, at times, subtle jealousy. Christina's language is intense, emotional, and intimate, suggesting a bond that shaped her daily life and courtly decisions. Ebba, in turn, responded with warmth and devotion, offering both emotional support and counsel. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians for centuries, but even where proof of romantic intimacy remains elusive, the evidence of influence and closeness is undeniable. Christina's court was unlike any other in Europe. She consciously created a space where women held intellectual and political prominence, often above men in her inner circle. Ebba Sparre was central to this arrangement. Their interactions were private, often occurring in chambers, private gardens, and the secluded spaces of royal apartments. Court observers noted the intensity of Christina's attachment, sometimes with admiration, other times with suspicion or envy. Ebba's presence granted Christina both comfort and counsel, and in a court dominated by male advisors, this companionship provided a channel for guidance and influence that was uniquely personal. The political implications of their bond were significant. Christina's decisions on appointments, diplomacy, and patronage were often shaped, at least in part, by her trust in Ebba's counsel. While formal records do not always attribute policy decisions directly to Ebba, letters and memoirs suggest that her influence was pervasive. Trusted confidantes could intercede in delicate matters, advocate for allies, and protect the Queen's interests against rival factions. In this sense, Christina's relationship with Ebba illustrates a broader pattern. The private alliances of queens and noblewomen were inextricably linked to political power, even when hidden from public view. Their bond was not without its challenges. The secrecy required by courtly norms, combined with the pressures of sovereignty, placed extraordinary strain on both women. Christina's position as an unmarried queen made her vulnerable to criticism, rumor, and political machinations. Ebba, meanwhile, navigated the fine line between influence and scandal, ensuring her loyalty did not compromise either her own position or that of her queen. Their relationship, carefully maintained and shrouded in discretion, exemplifies the tension between personal desire and public duty, a tension that has defined many of history's hidden female alliances. Christina's refusal to marry added further complexity. In an era when marriage was the primary avenue for political alliance and succession, her independence was revolutionary. It created space for female confidantes to exercise unprecedented influence, and for intimacy to exist in forms that defied conventional expectation. Ebba Sparre became, therefore, both a companion and a symbol of Christina's autonomy, a presence that reinforced the Queen's authority while simultaneously satisfying her emotional needs. The balance of power, loyalty, and affection in this relationship was delicate, yet it proved remarkably resilient. Letters between Christina and Ebba reveal a dynamic mixture of passion, dependence, and strategic awareness. Christina often expressed longing for Ebba's presence, lamented periods of separation, and acknowledged the depth of their emotional bond. Ebba's responses demonstrate her own attentiveness and influence, offering advice, consolation, and reassurance. These exchanges illuminate not only the personal dimension of their relationship, but also the ways in which emotional intimacy functioned as a mechanism of power within the court. Through trust, counsel, and devotion, Ebba occupied a role that combined personal significance with political relevance. The reactions of contemporaries further illustrate the prominence of their bond. Court diarists, visiting diplomats, and foreign observers remarked upon Christina's attachment to Ebba, noting both the intensity of their connection and the unusual position afforded to a woman in her court. While some accounts are tinged with rumor or exaggeration, the consistent theme is clear. Christina's reliance on Ebba was extraordinary, affecting both her personal life and her rule. Even as official records remain silent on the precise nature of the relationship, its impact on the Queen's governance cannot be denied. The legacy of Christina and Ebba's relationship extends beyond immediate politics. It represents a broader phenomenon in which women, operating within constrained social structures, leveraged intimacy and trust to exert influence. Their bond challenges conventional historical narratives that prioritize dynastic marriages and male advisors, demonstrating that private relationships could wield considerable power, even in highly public, male-dominated arenas. By valuing emotional intelligence, loyalty, and discretion, Christina and Ebba exemplify the ways in which female agency was exercised quietly, strategically, and effectively. Their story also illuminates the intersection of desire, autonomy, and statecraft. Christina's independence allowed her to cultivate relationships that might have been impossible for married queens constrained by dynastic obligations. Ebba's loyalty and intelligence enabled her to serve as an extension of the Queen's will, shaping decisions, influencing alliances, and mediating court tensions. Together, they exemplify a model of female influence that relies on intimacy rather than hierarchy, emotional resonance rather than formal authority. Yet, as with all historical relationships shrouded in secrecy, ambiguities remain. Scholars debate the precise nature of Christina and Ebba's connection, noting that contemporary norms and coded language complicate modern interpretation. What is evident, however, is the profound effect their bond had on Christina's life and reign. It offered emotional sustenance, shaped governance, and demonstrated the transformative power of trust and loyalty in a royal context. Christina's eventual abdication in 1654 did not diminish the significance of her relationship with Ebba. Even as Christina relocated to Rome and engaged in broader European political and cultural life, the foundations of her courtly alliances in Sweden reflected the enduring importance of intimate female companionship. Ebba Spa remained a symbol of the extraordinary possibilities of influence, demonstrating that a queen's closest confidantes could occupy roles as significant as any minister or advisor. The tale of Christina and Ebba also provides insight into the broader European context. Across royal courts, from France to Britain, similar dynamics existed, women of rank cultivating private bonds that shaped the mechanisms of power. These relationships were not mere footnotes in history. They were integral components of political strategy, emotional resilience, and social navigation. By examining Christina and Ebba's connection, we gain a lens through which to explore these hidden networks, understanding how private relationships could exert public consequences. Ultimately, Christina and Ebba's story reminds us that power and intimacy were deeply intertwined in early modern Europe. It demonstrates that emotional bonds could serve as conduits of influence, offering queens the counsel, support, and authority necessary to navigate treacherous political landscapes. Theirs is a narrative of loyalty, affection, and strategic acumen, one that continues to resonate as a testament to the often unseen forces that shaped history. As we close this chapter, we reflect on the delicate balance between personal desire and political necessity. Christina and Ebba exemplify the ways in which private relationships could alter the course of governance, demonstrating that love, loyalty, and trust were potent instruments in the hands of women operating within patriarchal constraints. Their bond, enigmatic and deeply influential, lays the groundwork for understanding similar relationships in other courts, including Britain's Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill. In the next part of the Forbidden Archives, we turn our attention to that very story, Anne, Queen of Great Britain, and Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, a partnership of friendship, loyalty, and extraordinary political influence. Their bond would demonstrate the far-reaching consequences of female intimacy in the corridors of power, and the thin line between devotion and rivalry that shaped one of Britain's most consequential reigns. Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill: power, passion, and political upheaval. If Christina of Sweden and Ebba Spar shaped Northern Europe through quiet intimacy and emotional allegiance, then the partnership between Queen Anne of Great Britain and Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, erupted across the political stage with unprecedented visibility. Their relationship was not hidden in shadowed chambers. It unfolded in full view of a court terrified by its intensity, bewildered by its consequences, and ultimately transformed by its implosion. Anne's reign, 1702–1714, was defined by war, political factionalism, religious tension, and the early battles between the Whigs and the Tories. Yet beneath these public struggles lay a private axis of influence, the unbreakable, fiery bond between Anne and Sarah that shaped decisions at the highest levels of government. What Christina and Ebba embodied in quiet gestures and letters, Anne and Sarah ignited through political ambition, emotional dependence, and an intimacy that unsettled the entire British establishment. Their relationship began long before Anne became queen. As young women in the household of Anne's stepmother, Anne Hyde, they developed an extraordinary friendship marked by unusual equality. Anne, shy and deeply in need of emotional support, gravitated towards Sarah's confidence, intelligence, and unapologetic assertiveness. Sarah, in turn, recognized in Anne a source of affection and trust that transcended the rigid hierarchies of court life. This early bond, formed in private chambers, personal correspondence, and shared struggles, laid the foundation for a partnership that would later dominate British politics. When Anne ascended to the throne in 1702, her relationship with Sarah instantly became a national matter. Sarah was not merely a friend. She was Anne's closest confidante, advisor, and emotional anchor. Their letters, preserved in archives and celebrated by historians, reveal an intensity of feeling that defies simple categorization. Anne addressed Sarah with terms of affection and longing. Sarah responded with a mixture of devotion, impatience, and strategic persuasion. Their correspondence was emotional, visceral, and at times tumultuous, evidence of a bond that surpassed ordinary friendship. For Sarah Churchill, influence was not a consequence of affection. It was a tool. She understood court politics with exceptional clarity and wielded her proximity to Anne as a mechanism to shape policy. As mistress of the robes and keeper of the privy purse, she held immense personal authority, but it was her emotional sway over Anne that allowed her to push for broader political aims. Her allegiance to the Whig Party, champions of the War of the Spanish Succession, and opponents of Tory conservatism, drove much of her political counsel. She urged Anne toward Whig ministers, supported aggressive war efforts, and actively opposed Tory figures who threatened her factional goals. Anne tolerated this assertiveness for years, both because of her affection for Sarah and her reliance on her counsel. The Queen's shyness, insecurity, and chronic health issues made her vulnerable. Sarah's commanding presence filled that void, yet the balance of power between them was always precarious. Sarah's political ambitions grew bolder, her tone toward Anne more demanding, and her public behavior more indiscreet. The court watched with fascination and fear as the Duchess's dominance over the Queen strained the boundaries of propriety and threatened to destabilize the monarchy. Privately, their relationship was equally complicated. Anne's letters reveal a longing for emotional closeness, tenderness, and reassurance. She desired Sarah's attention and comfort, often expressing distress at any sign of distance. Sarah, though deeply connected to Anne, frequently responded with impatience, frustrated by the Queen's needs and the constraints of courtly life. Their emotional dynamic, Anne seeking affection, Sarah demanding influence, created a volatile blend of passion and tension that shaped both personal and political decisions. The eventual rupture of their relationship was not sudden. It was the culmination of years of conflict, political divergence, and the arrival of a new figure in the Queen's life, Abigail Masham, Anne's distant cousin, and the woman who would ultimately replace Sarah as the Queen's closest confidante. Abigail was gentle, discreet, and emotionally attentive, qualities Anne longed for but rarely received from Sarah. Sarah, accustomed to dominance, underestimated Abigail's influence until it was too late. The triangle that emerged, Anne, Sarah, and Abigail, ignited one of the most dramatic political crises in British royal history. Sarah accused Abigail of manipulating the Queen, of undermining her position, and of endangering the kingdom through Tory sympathies. She confronted Anne in letters, and in person, at times angrily, at times pleadingly, but always with an edge of desperation. Anne, exhausted by years of emotional strain and increasingly drawn to Abigail's tenderness, began to withdraw from Sarah. The political consequences were immediate. With Abigail's rise came the ascendancy of the Tories, the dismissal of key Whig ministers, and a dramatic shift in war policy. What began as a private emotional realignment became a national transformation. Sarah's fall from favor accelerated as she pressed Anne to choose between them, a choice the Queen increasingly resented. Their final break is one of the most infamous confrontations in royal history. Sarah, in a moment of anger, allegedly told Anne to be quiet, a command no sovereign could tolerate, especially from a subject whose influence already stood on the edge of scandal. Shortly afterward, Anne dismissed Sarah from her court positions, stripped her of her political access, and severed the bond that had shaped the monarchy for decades. The aftermath was devastating for Sarah. She found herself isolated, politically weakened, and forced to retreat from the court she once dominated. Yet she did not remain silent. In her memoirs, she defended her actions, portrayed herself as a victim of manipulation, and criticized Abigail's influence over the Queen. The political establishment, meanwhile, grappled with the consequences of Anne's shifting alliances. The war changed direction, ministerial power reconfigured, and the monarchy itself entered a period of instability. For Anne, the end of her relationship with Sarah marked a turning point. She governed with greater independence, relying on Abigail's quiet support but resisting the overt dominance Sarah had exercised. Yet emotionally, the loss weighed heavily. Anne's letters and later behavior suggest a lingering grief, a recognition that what she had shared with Sarah was unparalleled in intensity, even amid its turmoil. Historians continue to debate the nature of Anne and Sarah's relationship. Was it romantic, emotional, strategic? The truth lies in the convergence of all three. Their bond was intimate, politically explosive, and emotionally fraught. It reshaped Britain's political landscape, influenced the outcome of the War of the Spanish Succession, and altered the balance of power between the Whigs and Tories. Most importantly, it illustrated how the private emotional lives of queens, often dismissed or overlooked, held the power to change nations. In the next part of Forbidden Archives, we enter the continental world once again, turning to the courts of France, where influential women crafted alliances that crossed boundaries of gender and expectation. Here, secrecy was not a shield. It was a necessity, as the stakes of desire collided with the pressures of royal lineage and scandal. France's hidden alliances, noblewomen, power, and forbidden desire. The courts of France have long been mythologized as glittering stages of elegance, decadence, and political intrigue. Beneath the chandeliers, behind the velvet partitions, and under the relentless scrutiny of courtiers huddled in salons, powerful women forged private alliances that shaped alliances, diplomacy, and the very stability of the French monarchy. Unlike the tumultuous public rivalry of Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill, the influential relationships of French noblewomen thrived in quiet secrecy, wrapped in coded language, discreet networks, and a culture of performative propriety. Among these women were aristocrats whose connections to one another, intellectual, emotional, and romantic, wove a hidden web of influence that helped determine who rose, who fell, and who held the king's ear. While France's kings pursued mistresses and political favorites openly, women in the nobility navigated a world filled with constraints, relying on intimate alliances to gain power in a system built to silence them. Their relationships were private, but their consequences were often deeply public. To understand this dynamic, one must step into the salons, exclusive gatherings that became the beating heart of French intellectual life from the 1600s through the 1700s. Within these rooms, furnished with tapestries, mirrors, and candlelit warmth, women led discussions that blended philosophy, art, scandal, and politics with unmatched finesse. Unlike the formal rituals of Versailles, salons encouraged wit, intelligence, and emotional candor. These spaces, dominated by elite women, offered a rare environment in which female companionship, sometimes affectionate, sometimes romantic, could flourish under the guise of intellectual collaboration. Some of the most influential salonières, such as Madame de Rambouillet, Madame de Sablé, and Madame de Lafayette, cultivated circles in which deep emotional bonds developed between women who shared more than philosophical discourse. Their connections provided more than companionship. They granted women the tools to influence royal policy indirectly. These relationships allowed them to support or sabotage court factions, shape reputations, and offer counsel to ministers in an era when formal power was denied to them by law and custom. One of the most compelling figures of this world was Madame de Maintenon, the eventual secret wife of Louis Roman XIV. Known for her piety, intelligence, and ability to command the king's respect, Maintenon relied heavily on a network of women whose emotional loyalty to her ensured her stability at court. While her own relationships with women remain the subject of speculation rather than documentation, the strength of her alliances speaks to the essential role female intimacy played in her rise. She understood that to navigate Versailles, an environment steeped in rivalry, rumor, and male dominance, women required bonds of trust that transcended mere friendship. The French archives also preserve letters between noblewomen whose emotional and romantic language mirrors that of Christina and Ebba Sparr, or Anne and Sarah Churchill. These correspondences, written in private, exchanged discreetly, and often encoded in poetic metaphors, reveal a dimension of female identity that could not be publicly expressed. They speak of longing, admiration, devotion, and desire. Some offer glimpses of jealousy, heartbreak, or betrayal. Others illuminate the joy found in a world where women could provide one another understanding and affirmation unavailable in arranged marriages or rigid social hierarchies. One such example emerges from the relationship between Madame de Sablé and Angélique de Saint-Jean-Arnauld d'Andely, leaders within the Jansenist intellectual movement. Their letters, filled with spiritual and emotional intimacy, demonstrate the nuanced intersection between philosophical devotion and personal attachment. While theirs was not a romantic affair in the conventional sense, the intensity of their bond illustrates how deeply female connections were intertwined with both emotional and ideological solidarity. Their partnership shaped not only the Jansenist salons, but also the political pressures exerted on them by royal authorities. At the same time, the French court was rife with covert romantic relationships between noblewomen, liaisons that existed far outside the gaze of historians trained to focus on male-centered narratives. Accounts from contemporaries, including diaries, memoirs, and private letters, refer to discreet relationships between women who navigated both affection and ambition. These relationships could offer emotional refuge in an oppressive environment, but they could also be weaponized. Intimacy became a currency, one that allowed women to build alliances, gain support, and in some cases, challenge rivalries that threatened their positions. While many of these relationships remain unnamed in official histories, suppressed by male chroniclers or obscured by time, their significance is clear from the patterns they reveal. Women who cultivated deep personal bonds with one another often rose in social influence. They secured patronage, shaped political outcomes, and defended one another against the brutality of court gossip. Their influence operated in subtle ways, through introductions arranged in salons, through carefully chosen words whispered in private, through letters passed quietly between chambers, through the sharing of secrets that bound women together in both trust and vulnerability. The court of Louis XV provides another layer to this narrative. While the king's affairs with women such as Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry dominated attention, the networks surrounding these royal mistresses were sustained by female alliances. Pompadour, in particular, relied on trusted women to maintain her influence, manage correspondence, and navigate political threats. Some of these relationships were deeply affectionate, providing Pompadour with emotional support in a world that viewed her simultaneously as a threat, a spectacle, and an indispensable political advisor. These bonds carry echoes of romantic undertones in certain written exchanges, though historians debate the exact nature of such relationships. What remains indisputable is that they formed the backbone of Pompadour's authority. She could not have controlled diplomatic appointments, war strategies, and cultural policies without a network of women who operated with both discretion and loyalty. Across France, The influence of noblewomen's private relationships resonated far beyond personal pleasure or emotional comfort. These bonds shaped literary trends, diplomatic decisions, intellectual movements, and social norms. They blurred the lines between romance and strategy, passion and politics. In a society where women were formally denied control over their destinies, intimacy became a hidden form of power, one that operated invisibly, yet effectively, behind the gilded walls of palaces and the conversation-filled chambers of Parisian salons. The hidden alliances of France raise a profound question. How many political outcomes were quietly influenced by women whose relationships never made it into official archives? How many treaties, wars, appointments, or cultural shifts were the result of an affectionate whisper between women whose trust in each other outweighed any allegiance to men who held the titles of king or minister? This veil of secrecy, shaped by necessity, also reveals the fragility of power in the hands of women. Their romances, friendships, and emotional dependencies could elevate them to positions of breathtaking influence, but they could also destroy reputations when revealed. Rumors of intimacy between noblewomen, whether true or fabricated, were weaponized by rivals to discredit and destabilize them. In a patriarchal court, female desire became both a private sanctuary and a potential political liability. Yet these women persisted. They nurtured alliances, built intellectual communities, and found emotional connection in a world determined to deny them autonomy. Their stories, though fragmented and often obscured, expose a crucial truth. The history of European monarchy is incomplete without acknowledging the women whose secret relationships shaped its course. Erasure, rumor, and the historian's blind spot. History is not merely a record of what happened. It is a reflection of what someone chose to write down, what someone else decided to preserve, and most importantly, what entire societies agreed to pretend was unimportant. When it comes to female same-sex intimacy within royal courts, the evidence is not only scarce, it is deliberately distorted. This chapter pulls back the curtain on the forces that shaped that silence. It is a continuation of the struggle revealed in Part 6, the ongoing attempt by monarchies, chroniclers, and later historians to contain what they could not control. The forbidden archives reveal that omission was never accidental. It was a strategy, a tool, a way to maintain political legitimacy while ensuring that royal women remained confined to roles defined by dynastic reproduction. The more we examine the gaps, the more intentional they appear. For centuries, chroniclers treated women's relationships with each other as harmless diversions, childish emotional attachments, or moral curiosities unworthy of political consideration. Male same-sex relationships were condemned explicitly because they threatened structures of inheritance and patriarchal authority. But female intimacy, whether emotional, romantic, or sexual, was often dismissed as irrelevant or impossible. This dismissal created a historiographical vacuum, and into that vacuum poured rumor, speculation, accusation, and erasure. Court rumors often preserved what official documents tried to hide. For example, in the 17th and 18th centuries, whispered accusations circulated through European courts whenever a noblewoman appeared too devoted to a female attendant, too disinterested in her husband, or too reluctant to produce children. These rumors were sometimes political weapons, aimed at undermining alliances or discrediting rivals. But they also reveal societal anxieties. If women formed private bonds beyond male control, What influence might they wield? Yet rumor alone is not evidence. Historians grapple with this problem repeatedly. Sources describing female same-sex relationships in royal contexts are often written by adversaries, eager to scandalize, penned by moralists, determined to pathologize, filtered through male observers, unable or unwilling to recognize intimacy preserved selectively, excluding letters and documents that were deemed improper. The forbidden archives expose these absences as the product of deliberate choices. In many courts, letters between women were destroyed by family members after death. Diaries were edited by husbands or sons to remove compromising entries. In some dynasties, entire rooms of correspondence were burned to protect the dignity of the lineage. These acts of destruction were not routine housekeeping. They were interventions designed to protect political narratives. Because of these losses, historians face methodological challenges. 1. Over-reliance on hostile sources. When affectionate letters between women disappear, only the accusations of their enemies remain. 2. Projection of modern assumptions. Victorian scholars, in particular, insisted that female intimacy was inherently platonic. Their interpretations continue to shape popular understanding. 3. Language barriers and coded writing. Women often used metaphors, religious framing, or poetic language to describe relationships that cannot be neatly categorized. Determining intent requires careful reading, not speculation. 4. Archival gatekeeping. Some royal families restricted access to personal papers until the 21st century, meaning historians still lack a complete record. What remains are fragments, emotional letters whose intensity testifies to suppressed histories, travel accounts noting unusual living arrangements, legal records documenting improper attachments, diplomatic reports speculating on alliances forged through affection rather than decree. These fragments, when placed side by side, form patterns too consistent to ignore. Importantly, the silence surrounding female same-sex relationships is also a product of gender bias. Royal historians traditionally prioritized diplomacy, war, and succession, domains dominated by men. Women's experiences were relegated to footnotes, their emotional lives dismissed as distractions. But Part 6 already made clear that affection shaped politics more profoundly than many rulers admitted. The omission of women's relationships is therefore not a trivial oversight. It is a distortion of historical reality. Silence itself becomes evidence. When an archive includes extensive correspondence for one male courtier, but only scattered references for a high-ranking noblewoman, something has been removed. When a queen's closest friend is described repeatedly, yet her letters are missing, questions arise. When portraits of two women are found facing one another in private chambers rather than public galleries, context speaks louder than ink. The challenge is not that history cannot reveal these relationships. The challenge is that historians must learn to read what was written between the lines and what was deliberately erased. Even today, modern biases continue to shape interpretation. Some scholars hesitate to label a relationship romantic unless explicit sexual evidence exists, ignoring that intimacy. Emotional, political, romantic can take forms invisible to traditional definitions. Others treat affection between women as inherently innocent, reflecting outdated assumptions rather than evidence. Yet the forbidden archives demand a more nuanced approach. If we allow ourselves to interpret royal women's lives with the same complexity granted to kings, ministers, and male favorites, a clearer picture emerges. Networks of loyalty, passion, and influence that shaped dynasties from within. As we move forward in the documentary, the necessity of restoring these hidden relationships becomes undeniable. They were not anomalies. They were part of a broader pattern of unrecorded histories, suppressed not because they were rare, but because they were threatening. The silence of the archives does not erase these histories. It challenges us to read more deeply, to question what has been presented as fact, and to recognize that the greatest omissions often reveal the greatest truths. Cross-continental lessons, patterns across courts, the silence found in European archives is not unique. Across continents, royal courts developed similar patterns of concealment, reinterpretation, and selective memory regarding relationships between women. What varies is the strategy of suppression, shaped by religion, political culture, inheritance law, and the visibility of female authority. The deeper we move into these global patterns, the more undeniable the broader truth becomes. The phenomenon of influential female same-sex bonds was not confined to a single region. It was a structural feature of monarchy itself, a recurring expression of agency in societies where women were expected to exist only as vessels for dynastic continuation. The Forbidden Archives demonstrate that regardless of geography, the combination of arranged political marriages, gender-segregated living quarters, and limited mobility created fertile ground for intense emotional unions between women. Some were romantic, some political, some spiritual, but all existed outside the pathways prescribed by royal lineage. Yet across continents, these relationships were routinely misinterpreted or erased, not because they were invisible, but because acknowledging them threatened established narratives of power. In Western and Central Europe, deeply rooted Christian norms shaped both the expression and documentation of intimacy. The combination of patrilineal inheritance and church-sanctioned marriage left little room for relationships that did not directly support dynastic production. Affection between noblewomen was tolerated only as long as it appeared harmless, framed as sisterly devotion or as courtly friendship. When emotions crossed boundaries, they were reclassified as scandal, madness, or moral corruption. But evidence suggests that these bonds influenced succession politics, controlled court factions, and even shaped diplomatic allegiances. The pattern appears again, although in different forms, in Southern Europe, where the Catholic Church maintained greater control over royal legitimacy. Here, female same-sex relationships were even more likely to be dismissed or morally condemned, unless they provided an opportunity for political manipulation. Inquisitorial records across Italy and Spain include scattered references to improper friendships among noblewomen, but these cases were often buried under moral language rather than political analysis. Yet their existence reveals that intimacy between women was recognized, precisely because it required policing. But to understand the global patterns fully, we must look beyond Europe. In the Middle East, historical documentation of royal women's lives is complex. Many courts in the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mamluk spheres practiced strict gender segregation, while also granting elite women significant behind-the-scenes influence. Political marriages forming alliances between tribes, consort families, and ruling houses meant that royal women often lived in close quarters with other women, especially during periods of dynastic transition. Within the Ottoman imperial harem, not a place of entertainment as misrepresented in Western imagination, but a political institution, female bonds were essential to survival. Senior women, known as valide sultans, wielded immense influence, controlling networks of attendants, advisors, and younger consorts. Personal alliances between women could determine access to the Sultan, influence succession decisions, and shape imperial policy. Very little is explicitly written about romantic or sexual intimacy between women in these contexts. But the absence of direct claims does not eliminate the possibility. It reflects the nature of the sources. Court chroniclers seldom documented private relationships between women unless they disrupted political order. What survives instead are hints, shared apartments, intertwined political loyalties, unusual transfers of property, or records of jealousy that surfaced during power struggles. Such patterns mirror those of European courts. Emotional bonds were visible, but their interpretation was filtered through patriarchal narratives. In Persian and Central Asian courts, poetry written by elite women occasionally references affection between women in coded language. Scholars debate whether these texts express spiritual companionship, literary convention, or emotional longing. The ambiguity itself is part of the pattern. Women's voices were preserved only when framed as acceptable. Their personal emotions reinterpreted through metaphors of faith or virtue. Across South Asia, influential royal women, particularly in Mughal and Rajput courts, formed deep alliances with female companions, advisors, and attendants. Historical documentation, again, focuses on political outcomes rather than emotional depth. But as in Europe and the Middle East, women's personal bonds often influenced succession disputes, patronage networks, and negotiations between royal families. The absence of explicit language about same-sex intimacy reflects cultural norms around modesty, not necessarily a lack of such relationships. Moving eastward, East Asian royal courts reveal a different dynamic. In imperial China, Confucian doctrine defined women primarily through their roles as daughters, wives, and mothers. Because female sexuality was considered politically irrelevant, unless it disrupted lineage, intimacy between women was often ignored by chroniclers. Yet the structure of palace life, thousands of women living together, many with little or no access to the emperor, inevitably produced intense emotional communities. Surviving poetry from palace women in the Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties include verses expressing devotion, longing, and jealousy between women. While these works cannot be assumed to reflect sexual relationships, they illustrate patterns familiar from Europe. Women found companionship and emotional depth within a system that confined them physically and politically. Some scholars argue that the absence of explicit condemnation suggests a cultural assumption that relationships between women posed no threat to lineage, therefore requiring no scrutiny. In Japan, the Heian court provides vivid documentation of aristocratic women's emotional lives through diaries and literary works. These texts include descriptions of intimate female friendships, shared romantic confidences, and private jealousies. But as in Europe, historians debate the extent to which these relationships were romantic or physical. Whether or not they were, their political significance is clear. They shaped alliances between noble families, influenced literary patronage, and sometimes determined the success or failure of male suitors. Across Africa, historical documentation varies by region, but evidence from royal courts in Ethiopia, Benin, and the Swahili coast demonstrates that elite women exercised political authority within gendered spaces. In some cases, Female advisors, co-wives, or companions formed bonds that directly influenced succession disputes or diplomatic negotiations. As in other regions, colonial-era historians tended to dismiss female relationships as domestic or apolitical, erasing the possibility of romantic or strategic intimacy. What emerges from this global survey is a consistent pattern. Wherever royal women lived under strict systems of political control, whether European Christendom, Islamic empires, African monarchies, or East Asian dynasties, they formed networks of influence that often included intensely personal relationships with other women. These relationships were minimized, erased, or misunderstood not because they were absent, but because they did not fit the frameworks that male chroniclers deemed politically significant. It is not an attempt to artificially impose modern categories onto the past. Instead, it acknowledges that royal women's emotional and political lives existed within parameters that chroniclers intentionally obscured. The global record, fragmented though it may be, shows recurring structures of intimacy, alliance, and influence. Patterns repeat, emotional bonds shaping political choices, female companionship interpreted through patriarchal lenses, archival omissions obscuring evidence, and a persistent assumption that women's relationships could never alter the fate of nations. Yet the forbidden archives challenge this assumption directly. These relationships did shape nations through influence over royal decisions, control of court factions, manipulation of diplomatic negotiations, and the redirection of dynastic succession. The patterns seen in Europe resonate across continents, revealing a global history of suppressed female agency. Rewriting history, queer queens and realpolitik, history does not merely record events, it constructs meaning. For centuries, the political narratives surrounding monarchies have been built on the assumption that power flowed along clearly defined pathways. Kings and princes wielded authority. Queens and noblewomen influenced politics only through marriage, childbirth, or regency. Private emotions were irrelevant to matters of state. Yet the revelations uncovered thus far, from the intimate networks of European royal women to the global parallels described in Part 8, demand a fundamental correction. If female same-sex relationships shaped alliances, manipulated access, redirected patronage, and altered dynastic strategies, then the historical record must be rewritten. This rewriting is not an act of revisionism. It is an act of accuracy. The more deeply historians explore the personal worlds of queens, duchesses, ladies-in-waiting, and royal consorts, the clearer the political implications become. These relationships did not exist in some apolitical vacuum. They were woven into the fabric of court life, influencing decisions that reverberated across continents. To rewrite this history responsibly, we must first acknowledge how power is constructed. In traditional narratives, royal women are assigned influence only when they act through men. Their power is perceived as secondary, derivative, or accidental. But when we map the emotional and political alliances between women, alliances sometimes grounded in love, sometimes in desire, sometimes in shared confinement, the assumptions collapse. The forbidden archives reveal that female intimacy frequently operated as a political force, albeit one unrecognized by formal chronicles. Where traditional histories see coincidence, the deeper record reveals coordinated action, letters that hint at secret communication networks, financial transfers between noblewomen, estates or titles granted to favored companions, and political factions organized around shared loyalties. Such patterns demand reinterpretation. Consider the recalibration required when examining diplomatic decisions influenced not solely by kings, but by queens whose closest confidantes were the women who shared their chambers. Or the re-evaluation necessary when understanding succession crises, moments when the emotional priorities of a royal woman shaped the survival of entire dynasties. History, when read with blinders, misses these inflection points. But when reconsidered through the lens of female agency, the narrative changes dramatically. And yet, mainstream historical accounts have been slow to follow this evidence. Why? Because acknowledging political influence rooted in same-sex female bonds requires rewriting long-standing assumptions about gender, sexuality, and the nature of power itself. It requires accepting that queens were not merely decorative symbols confined to courtly rituals, but political actors whose loyalties and desires operated outside the male-dominated structures historians have traditionally prioritized. Take, for instance, the diplomatic consequences of queens who favored particular ladies in waiting. These relationships shaped access to information, controlled who entered the queen's private rooms, and indirectly influenced decisions about foreign ambassadors, military appointments, and court patronage. A favored companion could become a conduit for factions, local nobles, or even foreign courts. Such patterns are supported by the very limited surviving documentation, letters with intimate tones, sudden career advancements for the families of certain women, gifts exchanged, and the jealous reactions of kings or other courtiers. Traditional accounts might dismiss such dynamics as petty court squabbles. But the forbidden archives reveal that these interpersonal webs were integral to the machinery of politics. Ignoring them obscures the true strategies employed by women navigating lives shaped by arranged marriages, constrained freedoms, and constant scrutiny. Another aspect of rewriting history lies in re-examining scandal, not as moral aberrations, but as expressions of agency. When royal women defied expectations through emotional or romantic ties with other women, chroniclers often labeled such behavior as eccentric, excessive, or inappropriate. These descriptions were not objective assessments. They were political tools wielded to shame or discredit. The language of scandal becomes itself a source of evidence, revealing what the chroniclers sought to suppress. When historians revisit these accounts with a critical lens, the true stakes emerge. These scandals often erupted not because the relationships themselves were condemned, but because they disrupted power structures. A queen who loved another woman might deprioritize alliances expected by her husband. A duchess devoted to a female companion might defy familial expectations about marriage, inheritance, or political loyalty. Rumors emerged when power was threatened. Accusations appeared when influence shifted outside the expected patriarchal channels. To rewrite the historical narrative, scholars must also confront the fragmentation of evidence. Many letters, diaries, and personal records were destroyed, either deliberately to preserve dynastic reputation, or through neglect rooted in the belief that women's experiences were unimportant. The scattered remnants we possess today must therefore be read in context, with the understanding that surviving documents represent only a fraction of what once existed. Historians must learn to interpret the gaps, the silences, as evidence. The absence of explicit reference is itself a clue, revealing what contemporaries sought to hide. The very patterns of erasure confirm that these relationships were more than idle speculation. They were significant enough to warrant concealment. Rewriting history in this context requires embracing complexity. Not every close bond between royal women was romantic. Not every romantic bond influenced politics. And not every woman who shaped dynastic decisions did so through intimate relationships. But recognizing the possibility, and in many cases, the probability, completely alters the framework through which we understand monarchy. This re-examination forces scholars to confront the inherent limitations of traditional methodologies. Political history has long relied on treaties, official correspondence, and state records, all constructed by male elites. Yet the most influential decisions often emerged from private conversations, emotional alliances, and intimate spheres that left little trace. To access these histories, scholars must employ interdisciplinary tools, literary analysis, cultural anthropology, gender theory, and a willingness to read sources against the grain. Only then do the hidden patterns of influence surface. Rewriting this narrative also reshapes our understanding of queenship itself. Traditional depictions emphasize queens as symbols of virtue, mothers of heirs, or diplomatic pawns. But the Forbidden Archives reveal a far more dynamic reality. Queens who cultivated alliances through personal bonds. Noblewomen who navigated political systems through networks of trust and affection. Court insiders whose intimacy granted them power unmatched by their official titles. Acknowledging female, same-sex relationships also reframes the concept of legitimacy. Monarchies have always relied on public perception. When queens formed intimate bonds outside expected dynastic pathways, the monarchy's tightly controlled narrative of lineage and duty was challenged. Chroniclers responded by minimizing or erasing these relationships to stabilize the royal image. Modern historians, by restoring these relationships to their rightful place in the narrative, expose the fragility of that image. This reinterpretation also challenges the assumption that power flowed only through marriage. Many royal marriages were deeply political but emotionally distant. Queens often found solace, companionship, or love in the company of women who understood their constraints. These relationships provided emotional stability in environments defined by surveillance and expectation. And in many cases, they offered a source of autonomy, affection unregulated by dynastic obligations. As we rewrite history, we also begin to see monarchy differently. Power was not solely exercised through thrones, councils, and armies. It moved through private chambers, personal confidences, and the bonds shared by women living within the suffocating structure of royal duty. These relationships shaped not only personal decisions, but also policies, alliances, and political trajectories previously attributed solely to men. If we accept that these relationships existed and that they mattered, then the entire architecture of royal history must be viewed through a broader lens. This is not an addendum to the existing narrative. It is a reinterpretation that reveals what has long been obscured. And so, as the Forbidden Archives approach their final chapter, we confront the central question: what remains concealed, and what truths lie just beyond the reach of surviving evidence? Legacy in silence. What remains hidden? The deeper we travel into the Forbidden Archives, the clearer one truth becomes. History is shaped as much by what is missing as by what survives. Across dynasties, continents, and centuries, the relationships between royal women, emotional, romantic, political, leave behind footprints rather than full portraits. The fragments endure, but the lives they represent remain partially obscured, like frescoes damaged by time, outlines intact, colors faded, details lost to deliberate erasure. The final chapter of this documentary confronts that silence head-on. We end not with certainty, but with a reckoning. The historical record of royal courts is vast and meticulous, yet the intimate experiences of women, particularly those who loved other women, were pushed to the margins. What remains now is a puzzle with missing pieces, suggestive correspondence without the letters that answered them, affectionate portraits without the context that inspired them, rumors that echo without confirmation, archives with scorch marks where personal papers once lay. The silence itself is evidence, but it is also a barrier. Some royal archives remain sealed even today. Others have been curated so heavily that the curators themselves became part of the narrative, deciding which truths were suitable for public memory. Families with centuries of prestige guarded reputations fiercely, destroying documents that hinted at scandal or deviation from dynastic expectations. These decisions shaped the limits of what historians can know and what future generations are permitted to imagine. Yet the fragments that survive reveal patterns too consistent to dismiss. Similar dynamics appear across Britain, France, Sweden, the Italian courts, and beyond. Queens who granted lands and power to their closest female companions, noblewomen who challenged the obligations of arranged marriages, courtiers whose jealousy of female intimacy sparked political conflict, and women who used coded language to preserve bonds others refused to acknowledge. But for every relationship we can trace, countless others slip through the cracks. Consider the letters written in affectionate, almost breathless tones, surviving without reply because the responses were removed. Consider whispered court scandals recorded only by foreign ambassadors, whose motivations were not truly personal but political. Consider the personal diaries edited by sons or grandsons determined to protect family honor. These gaps do not render the histories unknowable. Rather, they reveal the pressures that shaped the record. Silence is not emptiness. It is an artifact. It tells us where the boundaries of acceptable history were drawn. As historians reevaluate queenship, sexuality, and political agency, they confront not only lost documents but inherited biases. Earlier scholars insisted that female same-sex intimacy was either non-existent or irrelevant. Their assumptions became embedded in the narrative, shaping textbooks, museum labels, and national histories. Today, the challenge is not only to uncover what was hidden, but to dismantle interpretive frameworks built on those erasures. This final chapter acknowledges that our journey cannot end in perfect resolution. The forbidden archives testify to lives lived behind curtains of expectation and surveillance. They also remind us that many stories remain beyond reach, folded into the private corners of palaces, destroyed in acts of royal housekeeping, or preserved in archives still inaccessible. What remains hidden is not only the truth of individual relationships, but the broader implications they carried. How many alliances were altered because queens confided in women they loved rather than in ministers they distrusted? How many policies shifted because noblewomen, bound by emotional loyalty, supported factions outside expected dynastic paths? How many court conflicts originated in jealousy, not between kings and foreign powers, but between courtiers vying for a woman's affection? And how many women found solace, identity, and strength in relationships their world refused to acknowledge. The silence does not erase the impact. It simply leaves questions where answers should be, an open space haunted by possibility. Through this documentary, those possibilities come into focus, not as fantasies, but as historically grounded interpretations of the fragments that remain. Now, as we close the Forbidden Archives, the documentary moves into its final reflection, a meditation on power, truth, and the echoes of what was never recorded. In these final moments, we step back from the evidence, the fragments, the silences, and the shadows. What remains is not a complete chronicle, but a deeper understanding of the human lives that shaped history from behind palace walls. Female same-sex relationships in royal courts were rarely written into official records, yet their influence rippled across alliances, succession disputes, and political factions, quiet forces in a world that insisted women had no power of their own. The gaps in the archives remind us that history is always incomplete, but those gaps also challenge us. They urge us to question what we assume, to look beyond the narratives constructed by chroniclers who decided which desires were worthy of memory and which were to be erased. The queens, duchesses, and noblewomen whose stories thread through this documentary lived under immense pressure. Their marriages were arranged, their movements restricted, their roles predetermined. Yet within those constraints, they forged bonds, emotional, romantic, sometimes defiant, that shaped not only their private worlds but the world around them. These relationships were not footnotes. They were part of the political fabric of their time. What remains hidden is not a failure of history, but a reminder of its complexity. For every preserved letter, a dozen were burned. For every rumor recorded, a truth remained unspoken. The Forbidden Archives reveal that the past is not silent. It whispers through the fragments, inviting us to listen carefully. As we close this chapter, one question lingers: how many stories of love, loyalty, and power still lie in the shadows, waiting for the courage of future historians to bring them to light? Thank you for exploring these hidden histories with us. Until next time, the archives remain forbidden.